Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 510 of Humanity Rising. Yeah, we're still there. We're still going. And Jim, unfortunately, couldn't make it today. He had another commitment. So he'll have to deal with me for the introduction as well as the whole session today. And we're on day 4 of the Science and Consciousness Week, and we're very honored to have Roger Nelson with us today, and I'll say a little bit more about him and the framing of the session. I just thought we'd keep up the tradition, even though Jim isn't here, of doing a little heart meditation to kick us off. So Georg, we're just breathing to the heart, bringing ourselves present to today's session. So Georg, when you've got that music ready, let's bring that on. Great. Thank you, Georg. And welcome, everybody. A quick reminder for the chat, if you're using the chat and you want to talk to everybody, to make sure you move by the to. It normally starts with hosts and panelists, but you can click on that and select to everyone so everybody can see what you're saying. And I'll do my best to keep a track of the chat as well as we go along. So yeah, with day 4 of this week on science and consciousness, we had the kind of historical perspective, I guess, the first couple of days with Jim Hickman and Stanley on the first day, looking at the early days of the work that they were doing, and then with Callum on Tuesday, the kind of history of parapsychology. And yesterday we had that slightly wild ride on the tarot in VR, which was great. And today it's wonderful to have Roger with us. Roger Nelson, who was involved in the work at Princeton, which you've heard me talk about throughout the week, worked also closely with Brenda Dunn and Bob Yarn. Brenda, who we also mentioned, passed away recently, sadly. But Roger will be able to tell the story of a lot of that work as well, and then went on to develop what has become the Global Consciousness Project, which I won't present any spoilers now. I'll let Roger tell the story and surprise us all. And then tomorrow we finish off with Wolf, who is the scientist we've been working with to further develop the technology and its applications. So great to have you with us, Roger. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. It's really nice to see you and to join this, I guess, ongoing tribute to the planet and to humanity rising.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, we kind of started it at the beginning of COVID with this idea that, we need people who have got a kind of positive post-pandemic future was the idea, and started, thought we'd do it for a month, and then it just took off, and we're still going 510 sessions later. So great. Yeah, so I thought it might be nice for people just to hear a little bit of, your story of how you got into this, and some of the work, I'd say, at Princeton, and then how it led into the Global Consciousness Project, and then maybe we can go into that in a bit more detail.
I've been thinking a little bit about how I got into this, and I think I was a curious kid, but the real beginning of my interest in what turns out eventually to be the Global Consciousness Project is my encounter with Teilhard de Chardin, not in person, alas, but when I was in college. This is a really long time ago. And for those of you who don't know that name and that person, Teilhard was a Jesuit priest, but he was also a scientist, a paleontologist, who was one of the people responsible for discovering Piltdown Man and furthering the story of evolution. And then much later, I realized that this story of evolution that Teilhard told in a couple of books that I think anybody should read if they have a chance, one called The Phenomenon of Man. I don't know how to say it in French, but beautiful translation, and The Future of Man. They're both remarkably powerful documents of who we are. And his point was, in talking about evolution, was that the particles became the molecules, became the living creatures, became us eventually. And we have an inclination to think we are the pinnacle of evolution. And in some measured sense we are, but Teilhard said it's not finished. There's another stage for us, and that is to become a noosphere, that is a layer of intelligence for the Earth, that we could count on that happening because it is our destiny. So I can go back to talk a little bit about the Pear Lab, but that was a kind of the inspiration really for creating the Global Consciousness Project, because I wanted to see if it might just possibly already be in place. That there might be a very young, sort of still forming global consciousness made of us, but us in an evolved sense. And so we'll talk about it enough so you might see why I come toward the toward the end of the story, of this particular story, to believe that we are, in fact, seeing signs of an inchoate and kind of developing global consciousness, that it's real. And all we, in some sense, need to do for that to become a potent force is to make unconscious connections that we share and which are demonstrable in scientific data, to make those unconscious connections conscious. We are connected, and we are one, as the sages from every culture in every age have said. We've practiced being individuals, and it hasn't done us a whole lot of good. I think there are almost anybody who's listening to this kind of material would agree that we've kind of muffed the job. We haven't exactly become stewards of the Earth. So we have to change that. We have to become the global consciousness that the Earth and all the living beings, including us, desperately needs. So I started with Teilhard. But then many years ago, I was a professor of psychology in a small college in northern Vermont. I enjoyed that, but at some point, I had an inkling that the college was going to turn into something I didn't quite want. I like liberal arts. I like a broad education. I like the possibility for people coming to think. I don't care very much if they receive an education to get a particular job, especially when it's, well, I won't go into a whole lot more detail on that. Anyway, I also like research, and I saw by accident an advertisement in the Chronicle of Higher Education where lots of academic jobs are advertised, and my friend had circled a couple of those for me, what I might be interested. And adjacent to one of those was an ad from the School of Engineering at Princeton University that said they were looking for a cognitive scientist interested in the lesser known aspects of perception. So I started thinking about skin senses and sense of smell. What they were thinking about was much more exciting and interesting, those things. This was Bob John and Brenda Dunn looking for a partner to make the Pear Lab go. And so I visited there. I met Brenda by accident in the hallway, but I knew who she was because she was so magnificently gowned in a flowing red dress, not red, green. And she was heading to the dean's office, which I also was. That was Bob John. So we met there for my interview. But she was already unforgettable the first time I met her. So I'm very sorry she's gone.
You've mentioned quite a few accidents, inverted commas, Roger, in this story already, and somebody's made a note in the chat that they're like MOM, magic in ordinary moments.
Well, my favorite chapter title in a book I published with ICRL Press, which Brenda was the head of, and my favorite chapter title was Design by Coincidence.
All right.
So that's how that from early on, and certainly there's these last 25 years or so, my life has clearly been on a directed in a way by coincidences on a path that I was interested to follow, but it developed while I was on the path. It grew, more smooth and open and straightforward while going this way. Wonderful. Yeah.
So this was your interview. You left it at your interview with Bob and Brenda, and then that took you into the Pear work.
Yeah. Pear wasn't even called Pear yet. That's another story in itself, which probably many of our listeners will have heard. But anyway, the first things to do were to create a kind of really rigorous analytical method for remote perception, what we called precognitive remote perception, because most of the trials we did were when somebody would visit a place tomorrow, but I tried to describe it today, without knowing anything about it, without the place even having been chosen as a target. And so that was a major project at the beginning, and we did succeed in making a way of getting a precise score, figure of merit for each attempt, rather than looking at a bunch of them.
Roger, tell us a bit more about what remote perception is. I mean, I'm sure some people will be familiar with it, but others may never have really heard about it. So
right,
spend a moment just kind of what are we looking for here, and what is the phenomena we're picking up?
It is called also remote viewing, and many people will have heard that, but we changed the name slightly because we were interested in all senses, not just vision viewing. What we did was to select a target from a large pool of possible targets, and provide the the information, how to find it, how to get there, to an agent. That would be a person who would visit the scene and live in it, be there, be with that scene, and be a beacon for another person whom we call the percipient, who might already have tried to figure out what the scene was, or might tomorrow try, or maybe at the same time. The percipient's job was to describe where that person was. And we created a checklist of 30 questions that really were asking, is this part of the scene or not? It's like, is it outdoors or in? Are there trees and plants or not? Are there people in the scene? Are there straight lines? Are there 30 questions like that? And with those 30 questions answered both by the agent at the scene looking at it and the percipient yesterday trying to envision where the agent is or would be, we were able to compare those two lists of 30 binary questions and create an exact calculated outcome representing how good the match is or was. And without a great deal more detail on it, we were able to create a distribution of what such scores should look like by asking by making the comparison between the percipient's report and all other targets that were, possible other targets. And that gave us gradually a distribution like the normal distribution. So if people got way more or way less than what's expected by chance in correct answers or correct matches, then that would produce a higher or smaller score. And we conducted that, we lived in that adventure for quite a number of years and created a database of about 600 formal trials that included variations like having the target selected randomly, or having a person traveling in the world someplace but not known where, the place not known to the percipient, and asking that person to stop and regard the place they were at a given time on a certain day, and report on that as the target. So it was, there are other variations, things like whether people knew each other as the pair, the percipient and agent, and whether they might be a bonded pair. For example, people who knew each other extremely well, as you might guess, those people would tend to do a little bit better, make higher scores.
And one of the things Brenda mentioned, I think, to me, or it was in Margins of Reality or one of the books, was you seem to actually get better results when the percipient was trying to guess the location before the agent even knew which location they were going to. Is that right?
Yes, but very slightly. It wasn't significant. Basically, what we found was it didn't matter.
Okay.
Ultimately, it did not matter whether it was before or during or after the visit. Right. The scores would be roughly the same. There was very slight slope, but not even close to significant. That was true of time, whether before, during, or after. Also true of space. It didn't matter whether the person was visiting a target continental distance away or next door. It really,
the kind of thought that comes to me in that is clearly we're not operating in the material relative world of Newtonian science, but in a world where the time isn't linear in the way it is here. So it feels to me it's almost just like, it's not like agent looks, percipient receives. It doesn't have that kind of cause effect thing. It's almost like they all arise at the same moment. The event happens, and it's like percipient, agent, location all kind of happen at the same time or something. And I'm not quite sure. It's hard to explain because our language is, of course, so rooted in linear time. But do you know what I mean?
Oh, I do. Yeah. And if you ask Brenda about that, she would just say, "What time? What's time?" Basically, we're talking about a kind of non-local entity, which is consciousness. Consciousness, we're talking about consciousness space and consciousness time, and they're very different from, you know, geographic space or clock time.
Yeah,
It's
right.
what people use the term non-locality to describe.
So
We
is that
feel,
you spent most of your time at the Pear Lab working on the remote perception project, did you?
well, actually, no. We all spent a lot of time on all the experiments.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great place to be, so we loved doing these experiments and being, you know, introducing them to other people. Now, my next task was shepherding the REG technology into a, you know, experiment ready form.
Mm.
We Bob John had a student come to him and say, I want to do a project using random number generators, which some people claim you can affect by thinking about it. And she said, I can't find a faculty sponsor. Bob was the dean, and he had made a speech early on, you know, when these people came, the freshmen were coming in. He said, you do a really, you know, top-notch job on your academic work, and then when it comes time to do an independent thesis, you can do whatever you want. And she couldn't find a faculty sponsor, so she said, you promised.
Yeah.
And so he said, okay, and proposed that she study the literature, visit the conferences of people doing this kind of work. And she did, and she built a good quality experiment and found results that combined with the research in the field that she had done, convinced him that it was time for a high-tech look at the question whether human consciousness can actually somehow touch the world in the form of these random number generators.
Just tell us, describe for us a little bit for people who don't know what an REG or an RNG is.
Yeah. My wife says, talk about coin flipping.
Yeah.
It's really a high-speed electronic coin flipper. There can be other kinds of random sources like radioactivity, but the ones that most people have been using and we used in the Pear Lab are electronic. They have a junction, or you can think of it as a kind of switch in a diode or a field effect transistor. So that if the switch is off, there's a barrier against which our circuit pushes electrons. We set up a circuit that's trying to get through a switch that's closed. And it turns out that when you examine what happens to electrons at the quantum level, they don't behave like ordinary particles banging up against a barrier. Instead, they do actually penetrate the barrier in the sense that they appear on the other side. They are here and then they wind up over here, having gone through a space where they are not allowed to exist in classical terms. So there's a tiny voltage that develops on the other side of the switch or the barrier. And that voltage can be sampled. And if it's high, we call it a 1. If it's low, we call it a 0. And that process happens very fast. It's electronic speeds. So we can count 10,000 bits in a second or 100,000 if you go serious into the technology. But our random number generator, REG experiments, almost always used 200 bits each second. So the bits would be flying by and we grab a sample of 200 of those quantum level random bits. And that would, if you record those samples, you'd get a sequence that's random, unpredictable, completely unpredictable, because this quantum tunneling effect is itself quantum unpredictable. So in other words, what that literally means is there is no, the sequence that you're generating has no future until it happens. We know, nobody knows, not the quantum system either, what the future will be.
And according to, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that that's the place where consciousness has an opportunity. So consciousness does have an idea about the future. And so there's a almost, I think it's magical in a way, but we're coming to understand it a little better all the time. There's a connection between consciousness and the universe that's profoundly important and little understood. And the random event generator experiments are asking questions that allow consciousness to show itself connected to the random numbers in such a way that they become different from what they would have been, which is a rather strange thing to say because they didn't have, as I said before, they didn't have a future until it got decided. So we are able to jump in and help that future develop.
Wow. So according to traditional physics, you shouldn't be able to influence one of these REGs, right?
No.
There's no explanation for how one could.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that many physics people are skeptics, and one of the reasons that skeptics like to quote classical physics. It isn't possible in it isn't possible in classical terms. There just isn't any object hitting some barrier in classical physics that can get through it. So yeah, it's a little bit like impossible, but the data are, they're strong, clear, and long term. We've been doing this now for more than half a century in many laboratories around the world with a lot of different people working hard to produce the best, the strongest, clearest experiments they can do. And it's the outcome of meta-analyses, looking at all large numbers of those experiments as if those experiments were a data point. When you combine a bunch of experiments like that, and you find that instead of having the expected average outcome, you have something that's off to one side or the other side. That's a pretty strong indication. You can produce, depending on how you do that, very, very large probabilities against chance being an explanation.
And is it, do you think the reason why at that moment that there's a space for consciousness to influence it, do you think it's because of the unknownness, as it were, unpredictability, uncertainty of the future? It's like the moment when something's known, it's then, I guess, by definition linked to the past, but then it's fixed, almost like kind of in a particular reality of pieces and parts. Whereas when we had this theme coming up yesterday with the tarot thing as well, but when it's not known, then there's, the left brain mind, let's say, which likes to fix things, then it kind of shifts over, I guess, more to the right side or something, where there's just this, you're holding space for something that isn't known. There's a not knowing. And the moment that there's a not knowing, that creates, some kind of space, I guess, for the possibilities or for consciousness to enter into. Or how would you explain?
Well, I like that. I totally agree that because of this is what we see in the experiments. We never tested people to see what they, what Myers-Briggs category they fall into or anything like that. But we always talked to them. We asked, what do you think is going on? How do you do this when you're successful? What's the difference between that and when you're unsuccessful? So we are, always looking for an answer to some questions that are kind of well known to the sages. Once again, you have to be open. for the world to enter into your consciousness space. And there's a slightly different but closely related and deeply important sort of brother or cousin to this. That is, the consciousness is creative at the core, at the real base of these kind of things. Consciousness creates its future in some very important ways that we don't understand very well. So consciousness is, when given a task that's impossible, consciousness has to go to work and create the possibility. And we do that. We do that all the time. We don't realize how much the world is shaped by who we are and what we are hoping for and intending. As Gurdjieff said, it's not even just intending. If you make a decision, then that will happen. The world becomes different because of us. Yeah.
Would you say that's like when you make a decision, that's like collapsing the wave, inverted commas?
Yeah. I think, right. Very few people, I think of decisions that way. But if it's worthwhile reading Gurdjieff long enough to find out what he had to say about decisions. I think even in meetings with a remarkable man, he wrote about his, at the beginning of each year, he would sit with all the possibilities that he could envision. And he would make decisions ultimately. And those things that he decided that were the subject of his decisions became the year that was.
This Gurdjieff?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I read his work like really early on in my life, but I don't know how I ended up with the book. But it was very it really kind of changed my life. Yeah.
I know how I ended up with the books. Yeah. I had a student who his name was Paul Bohm. I don't think he was related to David Bohm, but who knows? He was an extremely interesting guy, a little older than most of my students, and he signed up for all of my courses. I said, Paul, you have to get a breadth of education. You don't want to just take courses from one person. He said, I know what I'm doing. And when it was time for Paul to move on, he was a traveling man. He went around with the Merry Pranksters and Ken Kesey, those are familiar names to some people, mostly in this country. In any case, he didn't have room or the capacity to carry all his books. So I inherited a rather nice library of books by Gurdjieff and by many of his followers.
Just there's one kind of comment in the chat, people referring to Dehana asks, is this at the precipice of the unknown, which seems to indeed be what we were just talking about, right?
Yeah. At the precipice of the unknown, we better be creative.
Yeah, right.
Because it will become, whatever was unknown becomes known, and we have some choice about what that's going to be.
Yeah. Wow.
There
you were kind of working on the remote perception and then developing the REGs. I mean, I know there was some work that had been done before. Was it Schmidt, wasn't it, who had done the kind of nuclear? Yes. But really, at the Pear Lab, you guys really developed the REGs in there as they're currently often used. Is that correct?
Right. Well, we stood on the shoulders of giants, as they say. Helmut Schmidt was one of those giants, and he had kind of invented the process of doing experiments with random number generators, because he was interested he worked for Boeing, the big aircraft company. And one of the things he wanted to know was whether human consciousness and intention might change the behavior of electronic systems. So he made a very sensitive kind, namely radioactive decay random events sequences, and he found that people could do that. And he found other rather wild things, like people could do that even if the data points, the bits had been recorded last year.
Hmm.
People
So,
could listen to the tapes, which is how he presented them,
oh yeah.
and they would become distorted. They would become non-random in ways that indicated that consciousness had intervened.
Now,
So
was this story that I'd read somewhere that I was looking for the other day and trying to get some confirmation of, that they recorded some tapes that had like the same length of classical music and a length of white noise, and then repeated it, and it was 50-50, right? And then they put the original recording in a safe, sent copies to a bunch of people, and said, when you listen to it, try to desire more of the nice classical music, right? And then people did that, and they sent the tapes back, and then they went back to the recording in the safe and found indeed that the classical music was now longer than the white noise. Is this
that I'm not familiar with that exact
but that's the kind of thing
protocol, but that's exactly what Helmut predicted, or actually hypothesized might happen.
Right.
And by just a personal note, when I saw that ad for the job in Princeton and called up and found out what it really was about, I went to the library of this college and looked for all their journals and to see what this is about. And one of the articles, maybe the first one I found, was by Helmut Schmidt describing this pre-recorded tape experiment. And I was at that time a music impresario, so I had great familiarity with recorded tape. And I said, "What? There's no way you can change the tape like that." Well, Helmut's.
I love that story because it just fries our kind of Newtonian linear perspective. You can, from the future, you can change a tape that was recorded in the past, and it actually calls into question this this whole idea of there being past and future, doesn't it? I mean, it's like,
yeah,
somehow that story, that understanding of reality doesn't fit these kind of phenomena.
No, I mean, it's ordinary conception. But now I guess, well out of that, so it doesn't surprise it. None of this stuff surprises me anymore. But at the time, I was just boggled and thought about it for a long time, and I realized ultimately that what could happen was that what would have to happen was that those tapes, when they were recorded, the decision of random decision of classical or not was made was biased at that time last year, not when I was listening to it, but it was already done, because what I was going to listen to was this biased version of the tape when I eventually got feedback. That's the kind of explanation a lot of people think works. I don't know if I said that clearly, but basically our future understanding of how things are affect our present actions, and even things like the nature of the pre-recorded tape.
Yeah. Well,
a lot of people think that's the retrocognition or retro PK, for example, might be an explanation for more or less all PK experiments and all remote viewing kinds of things and so on. But I think it's a good question. It's not easy to answer, but I'm working on that, and I think I'm pretty well convinced that what we're doing now is happening now. We can think about the future, and in the future we can even think about the past, but to explain everything by one mechanism with retrocognition reaching back and changing the present, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
But that's an esoteric topic.
Well, we might come to more of that at the end. But anyway, let's I just noticed while I can still see the comment Jenny mentioned in the chat. She's the work that you're doing with the Oregano group and including Peter Fenwick, and so Jenny's obviously familiar with that, and Peter Fenwick, a friend of hers. She's referencing the using the random event generators in the rooms of the dying to see what happens, and Peter Fenwick, I think, is trying to get that set up at in hospices in Scotland, right?
Yes.
But you've already had some results back from using it in the ICUs in Spain.
Yes, that's right. And Wolf is whom you
we'll hear more about
before.
that.
He's the analyst, and I think there are three cases, where the person actually passed, data were being recorded, and they show some pretty pronounced departures from expectation around the time the person actually passed, and also at points in time near that passing time, when other important things like the family converging, those kinds of emotionally potent events seem to be showing up in the data.
Yeah. So it's not just our and this kind of maybe connects us to the Global Consciousness Project. So it's not just our individual consciousness or intention influencing these REGs. They seem to also be reading a field of consciousness, right? Because I know you know at Pear you also did work on the collectives, and when collectives or groups of people seem to be aligned around a shared purpose or intention, that seemed to also influence the randomness, right?
Oh yeah. In early 1990s, I was finally able to get a continuous recording with the possibility of also indexing moments along the continuous recording of REG data. And we created what was called field REG, field reg experiments, to do exactly what you're talking about. Bob said at one point, he says, oh, obviously this is a double entendre. We're going out in the field, we're leaving the laboratory, going out in the field. And why? Because we want to study fields of consciousness, or consciousness fields. So we went to a lot of places like concerts, rituals of various kinds, ceremonies in churches, various kinds of meetings, gripping, personally engaging, deeply engaging meetings, for example, and also business meetings or conferences, whatever. So what we found was that whenever there was a very, a powerful force bringing everybody into kind of synchronous state of consciousness, everybody was blown away, as they say, by the aria of the really famous opera. One that is, the aria is something everybody knows, so everybody is wrapped in attention at the moment. So our data, they don't remain level wandering across the screen. They have departures from expectation, and but I think my favorite kind of experiment in that realm was when I had the joy of going to Egypt with a large group, 19 people, who are mostly very much interested in the ancient Egyptian spiritual worlds and nature. And we went to pyramids, we went to all the temples that we could go to. There were political troubles at the time, so we couldn't go to all of them. And took data when we, the group, were in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and especially, and sort of also sometimes doing meditations and chanting. We went to the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid of Cheops or Khufu, and went to the Queen's Chamber, did overtone chanting, some of us, because we had learned that, but we did a kind of ritual in that place. And then my friend Charles Overby and I were by this time fully Egyptian. We had, galabeas and wrapped heads and all that kind of stuff. And we were definitely operating as priests. So we went up to the top of the Grand Gallery, which is one of the most magnificent spaces. If you can get there, sometime do it. Anyway, we chanted everybody else up to the King's Chamber, where we then subsequently did 2 long meditations. So I started by saying this, one of the most remarkable things. The data are absolutely incredible. Every time we were in a sacred place, every time we had this group together chanting and whatnot, doing rituals in our own personal way. The data were departing. The data were showing effects of consciousness. They showed changes. No accident. When we went to the markets or had lunch or kind of a business meeting on the boat, on the ship, we would have not necessarily flat lines, but no kind of strong effects. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry.
Well, no, great. I mean, and I wonder, it brought up a question for me, which is, did you try putting REGs in these spaces when there were no humans there doing any rituals, just to see whether the place itself seemed to be generating some kind of field coherence? Or
in a way, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask. Well, it's a little bit different from that, but to answer your question, yes, but not in Egypt. It was too easy for things to walk away, so we didn't do that. But we have done that, and basically, I won't say conscious is absolutely essential, but it basically produces a much more robust effect if people are there investing their kind of conscious attention in the sacred place. But there's evidence that the place itself. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, and this is often happens, it's actually an impossible question, was this: is the sacred space that you're now encountering something that always was there and we discovered it? Or is it something we create by being there and giving our spiritual force to it?
Good question.
Yeah. And some people are very sure one way or the other. I'm not.
And what are your latest conclusions, or are you still not knowing?
Well, I actually, the best evidence for me was the cathedrals in Europe. All of the cathedrals, as far as I know, all of them that I had no any history of, started out as a sacred spot where the tribes came together, or the clan met to sing and dance, and then they became like a rock cairn, whatever, and then they became a little chapel, and then they became a church, and then they became a cathedral. Those places are clearly already there, but it may be just beauty. Why would we pick a spot by the stream that happens to have beautiful trees around and so forth? Maybe the beauty, or maybe it's the sacred spirit saying, come here, join me.
And when you did leave the REGs at places and didn't do anything there, did you notice any departure from random? Or
not much?
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? It was so funny because when you just started talking about the cathedrals of Europe, right as you started that sentence, a comment from Ada popped up in the chat which said, good question for the Chartres community, because every year with Ubiquity we go to Chartres Cathedral and we have a mystery school for a week, and we get the cathedral to ourselves one evening, and we get to walk the labyrinth, a candle lit with medieval music. It's an amazingly powerful place. But like you were describing, it used to be a hill. On the hill was a sacred grove, of trees where all the druids of Europe used to gather things, and then gradually then they built the cathedral on top of it and things.
I'm not content that question has really been answered, whether you put if you put an REG in a place that has been understood by us to be a sacred place. That experiment, I haven't done that experiment well enough to satisfy me.
I think Wolf did a little bit with his kind of dual REGs, where he took them into the Swiss mountains and compared it to like the city center hotels and things, and saw some significant difference in the readings between those two. But as you say, it'd be good to look into that a bit more. So, but this whole idea of collective fields and what you were discovering there, that must have been what kind of prompted you to come back to Chardin's thing, and is it what led to the Global Consciousness Project, was it?
Right. It was easy to see other, new questions that needed to be asked. What if you have 2 REGs or 3?
Mm.
What if you have, your REG quite some distance from the event or the activity that you're interested in? And so when I was at a conference in Esalen doing field REG kinds of experiments, and talking about it with a group of people. And in the Baz one evening, I met 2 people, a beautiful couple, who were proselytizing for, or promoting or doing everything they could to gather huge numbers of people from everywhere around the world to do a Gaia mind meditation. This was in 1997, January. And I said, my goodness, let me take advantage of this. And another one of those coincidences that direct things. So I asked all my friends, all the colleagues who do this kind of work, please take data during this Gaia mind meditation. I had 14 data lines from different kinds of machines and whatnot, but normalized everything, put it all together, and it had 100 to 1 probability against chance for a 5-minute period of Gaia mind meditation. And then later that year, Princess Diana was killed in an accident. We didn't have any kind of network of REGs running then, but the funeral would be attended in one way or another by what people in the media at the time said would be something on the order of 2 billion people. Whatever the number was going to be huge. And so I again asked my friends, please take data on that day, and again put it together. And it was again 100 to 1 odds against chance that we should have so much deviation from this collection of random number generators just in Europe and the US at that time. And those were prototypes really for then. So another kind of coincidence, I had organized a meeting of a bunch of parapsychologists and psychophysiologists, right? Because we were on both sides.
What's a psychophysiologist?
Sorry?
What's a psychophysiologist?
There are people who do a lot of brain activity measurements and try to understand how consciousness works. And some of them are pretty far afield. They were trying their best at the time to set up systems where a person who was had damaged vision or whatever would be able to make a mouse move or a button press that would like, for example, drive a car in the right direction on a computer screen, all this. So they were, those people were interested in parapsychology. They wanted to know what do we know as parapsychologists, and vice versa. The parapsychologists wanted to know what these high-tech people could give us in terms of technology. So I had several friends in the psi business there, and at one point we were talking in the hallway and came up with I think Dean Radin was the one who said, this kind of combination of an EEG and doing something for parapsychology, and this idea that you can measure the using an REG, the responses of people to an event like Diana's death, we could make a world EEG, and so that we proceeded to do that. I gathered resources and talked to friends, and pretty soon I had a network running, which we eventually called the first name it had was the EGG project, EGG project. Why? Because my son, who was a programmer for the original software, said, you know what you're doing is making something like an EEG, but it's an electrogaiagram. So EGG, and that name stuck. We still call those devices eggs. And that software is still running 25 years later. Same software.
Same software.
He and another guy.
So you put a number of these REGs around the planet, basically,
Yeah.
and then had them just running the whole time in the background.
They just run continuously, and they send data every 5 minutes. They send a packet to the servers in Princeton and now in the cloud, where they go into an archive, which is basically a complete data sequence for an increasing number of these devices, up to about 75 at the largest number, which creates a kind of swath of data, parallel data sequences from research grade random number generators. So you should have a completely random, pattern, like a tapestry with no pattern. It should be just random. And so then the protocol became pretty straightforward. We wanted to ask, we're creating a data history. We wanted to ask, what if we have an event history that has a major event that really brings huge numbers of people, as we had found in the field REG experiments, brings a huge number of people into a kind of resonant or coherent state of mind. And the prediction, we made a prediction based on earlier work, the field stuff, that when people were gathered together, driven or maybe by choice, by an event in the world, that we would see deviations in a positive direction from chance. And over the 17 years of the formal experiment, which ran until December 2015, we had 500 tests of this hypothesis that our global consciousness, when we gathered and were attending the same thing, when we were engaged by something that created coherence in vast numbers of people, we would see deviations in the composite deviation across the formal experiment. 500 trials has a z-score of 7.3 or thereabouts. That's a 7 sigma, according, that's the language of physicists, for an event that could not be explained by chance, unless except by a 1 in a trillion chance.
Wow. So what are some of the events like that where you've had the biggest read on the technology from around the world, which I guess would therefore suggest that the most people were paying attention or had a strong emotional connection to, I guess, in some way?
Right. Because there are a large number of events of several different kinds, we can categorize them into to big ones, large versus small, highly emotional versus not so powerfully emotional, and things like we can even categorize them according to how much compassion is embodied or whatever. And there's so those kind of questions can be asked, and we find that the larger ones are significantly more likely to produce deviations, or they produce bigger deviations, larger effect size. Highly emotional kinds of things will produce stronger effects. When the coherence is great, we will see larger effects. Positive versus negative valence, both tend to produce strong effects. If it's a strong positive feeling or negative feeling, we would get in both cases an effect. So a lot of people want to know, is there a difference between positive and negative? And at that level of analysis, there isn't, at least not in a strong, significant way. However, if you look at these individual kinds of emotions like compassion, it is one of the most productive effect size generators when events are powerfully, it's a subjective judgment. Is this evoking a lot of compassion or less, a little? So, but it's pretty consistent across multiple raters. Anyway, I don't know if that exactly answers the question.
Well, I was just getting, maybe you could give us a couple of examples of events that have created the biggest effect size.
Some of them are tragedies like 9/11 was a powerful effect. And I think most everybody would agree that there was a tremendous concurrence or gathering of attention so powerful that the effect in our data lasted for about more than 3 days. And it's an effect that is persistent over that long time. And we did a lot of different kinds of analysis because we were planning to publish in a physics journal, looked at a lot of different kinds of things, and every measure was showing aberrations and deviations around the time of the attacks, and also lasting much into the following days. But some events like the selection of Pope Francis produced a very powerful effect. The death of Steve Jobs produced a very powerful effect. Things like New Year's, maybe not so powerful each New Year's, but we looked at every New Year's with a couple of different measures, and over the repetitions, the New Year's proved to be a very reliable producer of effects. So that's, to me, an especially interesting kind of test, because what's New Year's? It's completely abstract. It's just an idea that we have about time and the change from one year to the next. It's abstract and arbitrary. And yet people come together en masse all over the world. Even if they, like in China, have a different New Year's, they celebrate the one going from December 31st to January 1st also, all around the world. So we piled up all the different time zones, did the analysis to say, what happens at New Year's? We predicted that there would be a deviation in the 10-minute period, plus, I think, plus or minus 10 minutes of actual midnight. And one of the analyses is variance. We, based on the earliest examinations, we made a prediction that the variance would drop around midnight, and ultimately it does. So you have a trace that's wandering along like this, and then it goes down, starting about 5-6 minutes before midnight, reaches the lowest point at midnight, then comes back up. So you have this kind of V-shaped thing right at midnight.
Wow.
Very, very powerful.
Very clear, yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat just to follow. Somebody says, what kinds of things have you found about the collective consciousness, collective consciousness that relates to COVID? Anything?
Oh, yeah. The system is actually designed for what you might call critical or momentary events, almost like an explosion happens, and if large numbers of people are killed, the world learns about it. So the system is designed to look at an event with a little bit of lead time, maybe because we're interested, is anything changing already before the event? And then it goes on for the typical event length is 6 hours. That's enough time for most of the world to be apprised. I'm terribly sorry. I lost the actual question.
The COVID. Have you found any?
Data around COVID? Okay. So COVID doesn't fit that pattern, right?
No.
However, there are moments, and so for long festering or roiling events like that, I have typically done something what people call a probe. So I try to locate within this sort of roiling history a moment that's especially powerful. And when COVID was declared a pandemic by the WHO, I think it was, among other things, the markets went downward precipitously. And anyway, I picked that period of time, the day of the announcement that this is a pandemic, folks. I think it's pretty easy to argue that's a good probe moment. And the result was a very think I had 6 different views of it. All but one of those were very powerful deviations. So yes, COVID was seen and felt, whatever, by the global consciousness network.
Picked up in that way, yeah. David asks, you know, because you were saying like something goes positive and it goes negative. He says, are the positive negative measures suggesting that both of those energies manifest in the noosphere?
To the best as best I can understand the question, I think the answer is yes. So we see
it doesn't differentiate between, it just shows deviation.
Yeah, the prediction that we always made in the formal experiment was for the deviation to be positive. So if the deviation turned out to be negative, it counted against the bottom line, if you will. So our accumulated line would go up and, when it was a positive line, and would drop down if it was a negative outcome. And but the positives outnumbered the negatives so much that something like 2/3 of the events matched the prediction, whether they were, even if they weren't significant. And the bottom line has a probability against chance of, like, I think it's about 3 in 1 trillion. After a certain point, it doesn't really matter. You either believe the data are correct or not. And if you believe they're correct, then you have to recognize that human consciousness has somehow invaded a random sequence or a random swath and changed it. What it does, the change, by the way, this is, I think, particularly interesting. We originally predicted that the variance across the network would be, that would be our measure. Turns out, Peter Bensel figured out that measure is almost the same thing as saying the intercorrelation of all the devices. If you have 70 devices, you can calculate the pairwise correlation. And if the original, what we call network variance, is positive, so will the correlation be. And both measures give you the same answer. But the important thing is that these devices become correlated with each other. They start operating together across global distances.
Yeah. And then it's much harder to deny, that something's going on when they're synced up like that.
Yeah.
And there was a couple of people asking about, what was it earlier? I think, Patricia was asking whether you can kind of have a scheduled collective event tracked by the network. And I was wondering whether anybody had actually ever tried to consciously influence the network of the egg network, as it were, the network of REGs.
According to the emails I received, yes. but there was no way to test whether they were, had an effect, because there wasn't a prior a priori prediction about it. On the other hand, we have made predictions about a lot of intentional events, like meditations and peace marches and Earth days and all kinds of things like that. So 1/2 of our data, roughly half, is things that happen that we could not possibly predict, but they happen. So we make predictions about what the data will show when it happened and the hours that followed. Other ones we can predict ahead of time, like New Year's, obviously, is going to be quite predictable.
Right.
And so are these web organized meditation events, which are sometimes really very big, hundreds of thousands or millions of people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of other people obviously wanting to know about specific events. Naomi's asking, have you looked at the Maharishi effect? I guess you're referring to when the meditation that reduces the conflicts and things. And
right. I have looked at 2 or 3 times, and the most notable one was, I think, 2006, which is a long time ago. But I think they were organizing as many city meditators as they could gather in Washington and also in Fairfield. for over a whole summer. And I didn't want to try to, again, it's the probe idea. So what I decided to do was to look at the GCP data during the days when they had the largest number of people gathered to meditate. They weren't trying to do this stuff, but the measure that they were interested in, independent of the meditation sitting, was social and activity in Washington, D.C. How many accidents, what's the count of accidents, murders, and strife of various kinds. And what they were hoping might happen and predicted would happen if these city meditators just sat and meditated, would be a reduction in most of these negative social measures. And they have found that many times. So I looked at the global consciousness data on every Saturday during the year. I had 14 Saturdays, and it had a very potent downward trend, highly significant, and it was correlated, maybe not significantly, but noticeably, with how many people they actually had. So there was a kind of increase and then a decrease in over that 14-week period of how many meditators there were, and the data line correlated with that. There have been other experiments more direct, like taking data at Fairfield in the giant meditation space. And those typically have shown that focused meditation, not trying to affect the device, will nevertheless show up as with a kind of effect on the device.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. We'll just take a couple. Sorry, you were going to say?
I was just going to say that's another indication why.
Oh, I think we just lost Roger there. Can everybody still hear me? Is it my end, or have we lost Roger there? Okay, you can still hear me. So somehow looks like Roger's frozen a bit there. Yeah, interesting one, Maria. Does it relate to heart coherence? Probably at some level, I should think. And Cuff, I do know that they picked up some effects around the George Floyd murder. I think also particularly around the funeral. I know they noticed he's dropped off. Hopefully he'll come back on again in a minute. What else have we got? Is there a way to link to his work? Well, he's written a lot of books, actually. The most recent one, I think, which kind of summarizes things most, is called Connected, published by ICRL. And that really kind of summarizes a lot of the work and the findings and things. Was he about to say that by not affecting the outcome? I don't know. Dan, if he was going to say that, I think what he was saying is that even if a group comes into a certain level of coherence, then it picks up an effect, whether they know that the REG is there or not. If they're trying, but you also see groups that can, try to affect the REGs consciously with a conscious intention. I've done it once. I had a room of 100 ethical bankers. It's not a contradiction in terms, apparently. This is from Triodos Bank. And anyway, they'd asked me to come and kind of challenge them on their mindsets and things. So I told this kind of story, and I had the REG kind of projected onto the screen. And they decided, good to have you back, Roger. They were just telling a story of I had 100 ethical bankers in a room once, and I had them, and they decided they wanted to try to make the line go up the screen. So on the classic kind of readout for the random event generator, if it was random, the line would stay along the middle of the screen, and then you could either make it go up the screen or down the screen. and it would pass a parabolic curve of statistical significance. So anyway, they wanted to make this line go up the stream, and it plummeted. It went really, really low down the screen through the line of statistical significance. So they proved, that they were having an effect on the technology, but it went the opposite way that they were intending, which we could probably draw all sorts of conclusions about that in terms of bankers and other things, but that's certainly possible. Hi, good to have you back.
Yeah, sorry about the interruption. My workstation it had some kind of Windows error.
Oh, okay.
I'm now on a laptop.
Okay. Well, that's fine. It's fine. Let me just see what else is. Maybe, Roger, we can go into talking a bit more about. So, after all these years of work and the findings that you've had, I remember watching one of Bob Yarn's videos that kind of told the whole pair story. And at the end of it, he basically says, look, we've proven beyond doubt, that this is, that the mind does influence events around us, and that there is a field. And he basically said, over to you to work out the implications. And like, click, that was it. So maybe, from your side, what do you see as, well, first of all, maybe how has this affected the way you understand the nature of reality? And then what do you see as being, the implications for us of these findings?
Right. I'll start with the word at the end of the sentence I didn't quite get to finish. It was consciousness is creative.
All right. Yeah.
So the global consciousness project, the data from these now more than 2 decades of experimentation tell a very consistent story, which is that we are connected. And it's an unconscious kind of connection. I think I may have said this already, but it is the point that I most want to make. I don't know exactly how best this can be accomplished, but there are lots of people working on it. What we need to do is to become consciously connected. We need to somehow recognize that we're unconscious, that there's something going on. There's a kind of, magic thread between you and me, and between us and everybody on this call. But it's more than that. It's between us and everybody on the planet. We're joined in a network of life, and the truth is that we are so close to somebody mentioned a precipice. We're very close to being able to take off and fly from that precipice. And if we do that, there will be a bright future. If we don't take off and fly, I'm afraid that we're going to wind up being, also ran. Evolution according to Teilhard was postulated us as the noosphere that would take care of things well enough so that we would have a beautiful appreciation of the planet, of the people, the love, the possibility of connection, and so forth, for forever into the future. Mm-hmm. And we're on the precipice of doing that if we get our act together. And it doesn't. Everybody has to participate eventually, but at first it will be only those who are, aware that consciousness is creative, and that we have the capacity to make a world that is beautiful and loving and living.
Great, beautiful. What do you think is involved in learning to and in flying, as it were, from the precipice? What is it? What does it look like?
I think we need a focus on educational musical comedy. So we need the kinds of things that everybody will be drawn to or attracted by. And so comedy, that works. You know, tell a good joke and people will be right with you, at least momentarily. Embed in the joke an educational point, and the people who are with you will pick that point up and maybe run with it, or ultimately fly with it. And then I guess the goal at first has to be something like, how do we learn to talk to people on the other side of the fence? Because there are lots and lots of people on the other side of the fence. They may be very good people, but they aren't listening to the planet speak, and they aren't ready to join together with all of those who are trying to save the bears and the wolves and the birds and the air.
I mean, I guess if anything, what the research is telling us is that the more people come together with a shared purpose and intention, the bigger effect we're having, at least in the information fields, let's say. And the way I make sense of it is that as we influence the information fields, the energy fields, we're increasing the probability of some kind of future manifesting. There's not the cause effect kind of direct. Right. We can never be sure, but at least it's like creating a pattern in the field, that I see it like a gravity well. You're kind of creating a gravity well that's attracting more and more towards it. So you're increasing that possibility. And therefore, the greater, if we can find a way to get that coherence, alignment that seems to show up on in the Global Consciousness Project technology, then that would seem to increase the probability of us being able to actually manifest what we're intending there. Would you agree with that? Or?
I absolutely and totally agree with that. I won't even claim that you took the words out of my mouth, but I could. Those are the kinds of, that's the implication. The implication of the fact that those events, either generated by us intentionally, like a worldwide meditation, or great emergencies that bring us together because they attract our attention. Whenever we are brought together, we create something like a consciousness field, which is, in my mind, also the same thing as an information field. Mm-hmm. And that information field has a couple of aspects. One, which you might think is trivial, except that it points to the other. And that is that information field provides structure for a random system. So that structure is imposed on and becomes embedded in this random system we created for the purpose of finding out if consciousness can do that. Consciousness can do that. But now we point back toward the direction of what all can consciousness produce and direct and create. So we had a sign we had a number of nice signs in the Pear Lab. This one was a postcard size, but it had an extremely important message. It said, if we all work together, we can totally subvert the system. And that, I think, also can be expressed in terms of the creativity. If we work together, we can create a beautiful future, a world in which, as Buckminster Fuller said, if we organize ourselves, we can support not only all the people on the planet in a pleasant and reasonable and fruitful life, we can do twice as many people, but we do have to organize. We have to pay attention and use that creativity that we have, the problem-solving ability. And so I'm a dear friend from college days who was a wild guy in so many ways, was the one from whom I'm drawing the educational musical comedy line. Mm-hmm. He added another term or two in there to attract yet other kinds of people. Mm-hmm. But the point is, I think, extremely important. We need to gather together and to bring our most creative minds and resources to bear on the problem of teaching ourselves, of re-educating ourselves in a terribly important way, but as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think most people on the call would agree with that. Is it just before we go, any kind of plans you have for the future of Global Consciousness Project at the moment? You're just going to keep on going on? You're looking to add
right.
or...
Yeah, I'm retired. I'm pretty much, I still run the network, but I don't give it all the energy it's required to keep it as big as it once was. But I am giving that kind of energy to a new Global Consciousness 2.0, a new network that will be an order of magnitude bigger. We'll have 1,000 devices out in the world, spread all over the world, with a little concentration here and concentration there, but trying to cover the globe nicely with a new and modernized detector system that will teach us more. It will have the ability to look at not just the finalized conditioned random numbers, but the raw material out of which they're made, to see if we can learn more about how what I think of as an information field, but nobody else, not everybody believes or understands. Anyway, we'll have citizen science aspect to it. So this is being put together by a group including GCP and Global Coherence Initiative, which is part of the HeartMath Institute, and IONS, which is the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and people from other places as well. So we have a group of about a dozen, deeply invested in meeting regularly. And I think the test version, the first 20 or so devices will be out there, plugged in and ready to go in maybe in the next month or two.
Wow, that's very exciting. Where can people find out more? A few people have asked more about your work and these things.
Okay, my website for the Global Consciousness Project is global-mind.org. And that has a nice menu, which and also a search function, which will help people find any particular thing they might be interested in. There's, look, the menu is educational. So you look at the menu to find the kinds of things you're interested in. The Global Coherence Initiative has a page or some information about GCP 2.0. GCP 2.0 has not yet finished, had made ready the new website that it will have, but you'll be able to get a link to that from my website or from that of the Global Coherence Initiative or IONS for that matter.
Brilliant. Great. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Roger, and for sharing the story and insights. I mean, what a piece of work. Firstly, you, Brenda, Bob, and the team at Princeton did. And it's been, I've said this a number of times, but so useful to actually have that scientific research behind backing up these kind of statements. If I'm talking to groups or whatever, and to be able to show them the evidence and actually run the technology. I mean, really an incredible contribution, I think, to helping us all shift that mindset and remember, like you say, the nature of our interconnectedness.
Remember and restore and restore,
yeah.
And there will be resurgence.
And there we go, and there will be resurgence. Yeah. Just if
Thank
you have,
Peter.
Well, you're very welcome. If you have time, Roger, there is an after chat. So what happens is a number of people who've been on the call get together on a video session, so people can see each other and talk to each other. The link's in the chat, which you can kind of copy if you have time and follow up afterwards. But I'm sure people would love to see you there if you do have the time or energy. to join that.
I absolutely do. I will enjoy doing that. I struggled to get to the chat using my workstation mouse, but now I have found the chat.
Oh, there you go. Great. So yeah, thanks again.
Go ahead and join that now.
Once we've logged off here, that'd be great. You can click the link and launch Zoom, but hold off on clicking the leave and join until you want to join, says Shannon. So that's that piece. Just to remind everybody, for the people on who haven't been on so far this week, we have the Science and Consciousness event that obviously is very inspired by the work that Roger and the team did at Princeton. And we ran it for the first time last year, running it again this year in Yorkshire in the UK, where we have all of the equipment that Roger and the team developed there now set up and nearly running, but will certainly be running by the end of October when we have this event. So you'll be able to play with this equipment that where you could actually see the influence of your intention, the influence of the collective on the technology. We've got a 10% discount running this week during Science and Consciousness, so feel free to check it out. There, still trying to convince Roger to come. He hasn't completely excluded it, but he is going to be moving house around that time. So we're intending in our own way, Roger, that'll all go in such a way that you will actually have the time and space to come and join us. If not this year, then at least next year at Science and Consciousness.
I would love that, yeah.
Because I know a lot of the research team and the Origino team is joining as well. So it would be obviously great to have you there. So thank you very much again. Tomorrow we have joining us Wolfhard Janu, who I've been working fairly closely with, as has Roger and many people now, who's the kind of scientist and analyst developing the technology and has done a lot of this, been involved very much in this, the research around people dying most recently this year, last few months really, and seeing how that registers, and who we have some interesting plans with to develop technology to go into households and meeting rooms based on this, that will hopefully remind people of the nature of our interconnectedness. So when we're going to be doing some live experiments tomorrow as well, we'll have some REGs running. I might pull out my mind lamp here so that we can, as a group, see if we can influence it with our intention and have some fun together. So hopefully see a lot of you tomorrow. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you again, Roger. And
thank you, Peter.
All the best with the project. Okay, bye for now.